The brown gilding exploded against the auction ring fence like a storm trapped in bone and muscle. His body a blur of desperate motion as he fought every rope, every voice, every pair of eyes that dared to judge his worth. Metal groaned under the impact of his hooves as he struck again and again, seeking escape from this arena of whispered calculations and cold appraisals. Beneath the scorching afternoon sun, dust rose in clouds around his frantic movements, each strike sending handlers scrambling backward with wide eyes and nervous laughter. This wasn't the gentle schooling horse they were accustomed to managing. This was something wild and unbroken, something that carried the scent of desperation in every labored breath. His coat told the story they all pretended not to see. Dull brown hair lay flat against ribs that pressed too sharply beneath scarred skin, while his mane hung in tangles that spoke of months without care. But it was his eyes that made even the most experienced horseman look away. They burned with a fury that went deeper than hunger or neglect, a rage that seemed to rise from some place beyond reach. The crowd shifted uncomfortably in the makeshift bleachers, their polished boots and pressed shirts a stark contrast to the raw violence unfolding before them. Mothers pulled children closer as the gelding reared again, his front hooves slicing through air that offered no freedom. These people had come for gentle riding horses and well-trained prospects, not for the kind of broken spirit that reflected too much truth about the world's capacity for cruelty. When the handlers tried to position him for viewing, he wheeled away with such force that the lead rope burned through their gloves. His nostrils flared wide, drinking in the scent of fear and judgment that hung thick in the dusty air. Every muscle in his body screamed defiance against the system that had reduced him to lot number and liability concern. The auctioneer's voice carried across the ring with forced professional cheer, but uncertainty crept into his practiced cadence as he struggled to find selling points for an animal that seemed determined to prove himself unsellable. No bloodline papers existed for this creature, no training records to recommend him to the families seeking gentle companions for their children. Sweat darkened his coat as he continued his frantic pacing, each step a declaration that submission was not in his vocabulary. The sun beat down mercilessly on the outdoor arena, turning the air into a shimmering haze of heat and desperation. But the brown gilding's fire burned hotter than any weather could match. In that ring of commerce and careful calculation, surrounded by people who measured value in dollars and docility, one creature refused to accept their verdict. His rebellion wasn't just against the ropes that held him or the voices that dismissed him. It was against a world that had forgotten the difference between broken and unbroken. Sometimes the hardest truths reveal themselves not in what people say, but in what they refuse to acknowledge. And that afternoon, the auctioneer found himself face to face with a reality that made his practiced confidence falter. Harold Jameson had been calling horse sales for 37 years, his voice carrying across countless rings as he transformed nervous energy into profitable transactions. But when the brown gilding entered his arena, something shifted in the rhythm of his world. The animal moved like contained lightning, every step a testament to barely restrained fury that seemed to pulse outward in waves the crowd could feel in their bones. His ears lay pinned so flat against his skull, they disappeared into his mane. And when anyone approached the fence rails, he charged with such violence that seasoned horsemen instinctively stepped backward. This wasn't the manageable resistance Harold had learned to work around during decades of difficult sales. Harold's practiced eye cataloged what he saw with growing unease. The gilding's nostrils flared wide with each breath, revealing the pink interior that spoke of stress levels far beyond normal auction nerves. Sweat darkened his coat, despite the handlers having done nothing more than lead him into the ring, and his eyes held a wildness that went deeper than simple fear or confusion. The bidding started at $200, a number that would have been insulting for any other horse in the day's lineup. But as Harold scanned the crowd, looking for the raised hands and subtle nods that usually drove prices upward, he found only averted gazes and uncomfortable shifting. The silence stretched longer than it should have, longer than it ever had in his experience. $150, he called, dropping the opening bid with reluctance that tasted bitter in his throat. Still nothing. The brown gelding continued his frantic pacing, striking at shadows and memories only he could see, while potential buyers whispered among themselves about liability insurance and medical bills. Harold had sold horses with behavioral issues before, animals that required experienced hands and patient training. But this felt different. This creature carried something darker, something that made even the most confident horse traders shake their heads and look toward the next lot. The usual jokes about project horses and fixer-uppers died before they reached anyone's lips. $100, Harold announced, his voice carrying a note he had never heard before. The number hung in the dusty air like an accusation, a price that reduced a living being to the cost of a decent saddle pad. The brown gelding seemed to sense the weight of that judgment, his movements becoming more desperate, more violent. In all his years of turning horses into transactions, Harold had never encountered an animal that seemed to understand he was being measured and found worthless. The gelding's fury wasn't just physical resistance, it was the rage of something that knew it was being abandoned by a world that had already written its story without bothering to read past the first chapter. Some arrivals change everything without announcing their intentions. And that dusty afternoon, a battered pickup truck rolled onto the auction grounds carrying more than just another potential buyer. The vehicle moved with deliberate slowness, as if its driver understood that rushing toward destiny only guaranteed you'd miss the lessons hidden in the journey itself. Dust trailed behind the weathered Ford, like a story being written across the hardpan earth, each particle catching the harsh afternoon light before settling back into the ground that had witnessed countless such arrivals over the decades. But there was something different about this approach, something that made a few heads turn despite the continuing drama in the auction ring. From the driver's seat emerged a man whose 65 years had been carved into his face by sun and wind, and the kind of hard-earned wisdom that comes only from spending a lifetime listening to what the world actually says rather than what people claim it means. His movements carried the unhurried confidence of someone who had nothing left to prove to anyone except himself, each step measured and purposeful without being rushed. His cowboy hat sat at exactly the right angle, not for show but for function, its brim shaped by countless mornings when the sun rose too early and too bright for comfort. The leather of his boots had been shaped by more miles of walking than most people drove in a year, worn smooth in places that spoke of stirrups and fence posts, of long days spent in conversation with animals that communicated through body language and instinct. He paused at the edge of the auction grounds, his steel-gray eyes taking in the scene, with the kind of assessment that missed nothing important while dismissing everything that didn't matter. The crowd, the fancy horse trailers, the nervous energy of people trying too hard to look like they belonged. None of it registered as significant in his quiet evaluation of what was actually happening here. His shirt was pressed but not pristine, clean but bearing the honest wrinkles that came from a man who did his own laundry and had better things to worry about than appearances. A simple silver belt buckle caught the light, earned rather than purchased, speaking of achievements measured in different currencies than the ones most people understood. As he walked toward the auction ring, his presence seemed to settle something in the air around him, not commanding attention so much as simply existing with such authentic certainty that everything else shifted slightly to accommodate his reality. Other buyers glanced his way with the kind of recognition that had nothing to do with fame and everything to do with sensing someone who operated by different rules than the ones governing their own lives. The sounds of the ongoing auction reached him as he approached, the auctioneer's increasingly desperate attempts to generate interest in the brown gelding mixing with the crowd's growing discomfort. But the old cowboy's expression remained unchanged, as if he had arrived knowing exactly what he would find, and was simply waiting for the moment when everyone else would finally see it too. Recognition flows between kindred spirits without need for words or explanation, and when the old cowboy positioned himself against the auction ring fence, something profound shifted in the geometry of understanding that afternoon. His weathered hands gripped the top rail with the same quiet confidence that had steadied him through decades of moments when others saw only chaos, but he saw possibility waiting to be acknowledged. The brown gelding continued his frantic pacing, Each step a declaration of war against circumstances beyond his control. But the cowboy's trained eye caught what the crowd had missed entirely. Beneath the rage and desperation that painted every movement with violence, there was intelligence burning in those dark eyes. Not the dull acceptance of broken animals, but the sharp awareness of something that still believed in its own worth, despite all evidence to the contrary. Every strike of hooves against metal, every wheel away from approaching handlers, carried a precision that spoke of calculated defense rather than mindless panic. This horse wasn't just angry. He was protecting himself the only way he had learned how, building walls of fury around whatever remained of his trust, because gentleness had proven too dangerous to risk. The cowboy watched the gelding's ears flick forward for just an instant when a child's laugh carried across the auction grounds, saw how his nostrils tested the air for scents that might carry safety instead of threat. These were the signs others missed while focusing on the drama of resistance, the tiny cracks in armor that revealed the creature still living beneath layers of learned survival. Something familiar stirred in the old man's chest as he observed this fierce independence, this refusal to surrender dignity, even when surrender might mean comfort. He recognized the particular kind of pride that wouldn't bend because bending had led to breaking too many times before. It was written in the arch of the gelding's neck, in the way he carried his head high despite exhaustion, in how he claimed every inch of space his body occupied as rightfully his own. The cowboy's steel-gray eyes softened with understanding that had nothing to do with pity and everything to do with kinship. He had seen that same protective fury in his own mirror during years when the world had tried to convince him he was worth less than his asking price. When gentleness had felt like weakness and trust had seemed like luxury he couldn't afford. Other buyers continued their whispered assessments of liability and difficulty, but the cowboy saw past their surface judgments to the truth underneath. This animal wasn't broken. He was unfinished. All that rage and fire could be channeled into something magnificent if someone was willing to speak the language of patience rather than dominance, of respect rather than conquest. As the auctioneer's voice grew more desperate in his attempts to generate interest, the old cowboy remained motionless against the fence, simply watching and being watched in return. The brown gelding had noticed him too, those intelligent eyes flicking toward the one person in the crowd who wasn't trying to assess his market value or calculate his potential for reformation. In that exchange of recognition, something passed between man and horse that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with understanding. Sometimes the most profound acts of faith masquerade as simple transactions, and that afternoon when the auctioneer's voice cracked with defeat as he called for any final bids on the problem horse, expecting only the hollow echo of silence, a gravelly voice rose from the back of the crowd like an answer to a prayer. Nobody knew they were praying. The sound cut through the dusty air with quiet authority, not loud, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty that made every head turn toward its source. There stood the old cowboy, his weathered hand raised not in desperation or impulse, but with the deliberate calm of someone who had just recognized exactly what he was looking for. $150, he called out, the number hanging in the scorching air, like a challenge to everything the crowd believed about wisdom and foolishness. Around him whispers erupted like small fires, spreading disbelief from seat to seat as people processed what they had just witnessed. The murmurs carried fragments of judgment and concern, voices wondering aloud if age had finally caught up with the old man's reasoning, if decades of hard living had clouded his ability to recognize a lost cause when it stood thrashing before him. But their skepticism washed over him like rain over stone, leaving no impression on the certainty that had settled deep in his bones. This wasn't just money he was offering, this was something far more valuable and infinitely rarer, a chance. Not the conditional opportunity that came with expectations and timelines, but the kind of open-ended possibility that asked nothing except the willingness to try again. He was bidding with decades of experience, working with horses others had written off, with patience earned through countless mornings when progress measured itself in heartbeats rather than milestones. The auctioneer's gavel hesitated in midair, uncertainty flickering across his face as he processed this unexpected development. "Going once," he called, his voice carrying a note of surprise that hadn't been there moments before. The brown gelding continued his frantic pacing, but something in his movement had shifted, as if he too sensed that the energy in the arena had fundamentally changed. People shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some shaking their heads with the kind of pity reserved for decisions they couldn't understand. Others leaning forward with curiosity about what they were witnessing, but the old cowboy remained motionless, his hand still raised, his expression carrying the serene confidence of someone who had stopped caring what other people thought about his choices decades ago. "Going twice," the auctioneer continued, scanning the crowd one final time for any competing bids that would never come. The silence stretched taut, as wire broken only by the brown gelding's restless movement and the distant sound of traffic beyond the auction grounds. When the gavel finally fell, its sharp crack echoing across the arena like a period at the end of a very long sentence, the old cowboy stepped forward with the same steady determination that had carried him through decades of moments exactly like this one. He moved toward the chaos in the ring, not as a purchaser claiming property, but as someone who had just made a promise he intended to keep. Trust begins with the smallest surrender. And that afternoon, the real test wasn't whether the old cowboy could load a dangerous horse into his trailer, but whether both man and animal could find a language deeper than fear and older than the scars that shaped their understanding of the world. What followed became an hour-long meditation on patience, a dance choreographed by instinct and necessity rather than force or schedule. The brown gelding fought every step toward the trailer, with the desperation of something that had learned transportation meant only darker destinations. His hooves struck sparks against the metal loading ramp as he reared back against the lead rope, eyes rolling white with panic that went beyond simple resistance. This was the terror of accumulated betrayals, of promises broken so thoroughly that hope itself had become dangerous. But the cowboy didn't rush, didn't force, didn't allow frustration to poison the delicate atmosphere he was trying to create. Instead, he positioned himself like a weathered fence post, immovable but not threatening, present without being invasive. His breathing remained steady, even when the gelding's panic reached fever pitch, his voice maintaining the same low timbre whether the horse was standing still or exploding in fury. Time moved differently in that small space between truck and trailer, measured not in minutes but in the rhythm of settling nerves and gradually slowing heartbeats. The cowboy waited for those brief moments when exhaustion overcame fury, when the gelding's breathing deepened just enough to allow approach without triggering another explosion of defensive violence. Each touch became a negotiation written in the ancient language of pressure and release. The cowboy's weathered hand would extend slowly, offering contact that asked permission rather than demanding submission. When the horse's muscles coiled for another strike, the hand would retreat without judgment, waiting for the next opportunity with the patience of stone shaped by water. The crowd had long since dispersed, leaving only the essential participants in this ritual of careful approach and cautious retreat. Sweat darkened both man and horse, despite the late afternoon shadows, their shared exhaustion becoming a bridge across the chasm of mistrust that separated them. The cowboy's movements grew smaller, more subtle, reading the microscopic signs that telegraphed the difference between fear and fury. It wasn't trust yet that finally allowed the gelding's hoof to touch the trailer ramp. It was something more fragile and infinitely more precious. The first crack in a wall, built by years of mistreatment, the tiny fissure through which possibility might eventually flow. The brown gelding's breathing had shifted from the sharp gasps of panic to something deeper, more thoughtful, as if some part of him was beginning to consider that this human might operate by different rules than the ones that had taught him violence. When the trailer door finally closed with the soft click of successful loading, both man and horse stood trembling with the effort of their first shared victory. The cowboy's hand rested briefly on the warm metal of the trailer wall, feeling the shift of weight inside as the gelding found his balance. It was the smallest possible beginning, fragile as morning frost, but it was a beginning nonetheless. Healing happens in increments so small, they can't be measured by calendars or clocks. And back at the ranch where dust motes danced in shafts of morning light, the cowboy and the brown gelding began writing a story that could only be told in the language of patient persistence and quiet faith. Days blurred into weeks as they learned each other's rhythms, each other's boundaries, each other's capacity for hope, despite evidence that hope was a luxury neither could afford. The ranch itself seemed to hold its breath during those early weeks, as if understanding that something fragile was taking root in the space between desperation and possibility. The old barns and weathered fences had witnessed countless such attempts before, but there was something different about this particular dance of approach and retreat, something that spoke to deeper currents than simple horse training. Every small victory became a foundation for the next attempt at connection. The morning the brown gelding didn't flinch when the cowboy entered his paddock. The afternoon he allowed a hand to rest on his neck for 3 full seconds before tension seized his muscles again. The evening his ears pricked forward at the sound of approaching boots rather than pinning flat against his skull in preparation for battle. But setbacks followed each breakthrough, with the reliability of weather patterns, reminding both man and horse that progress was never linear in the geography of damaged trust. The gelding still kicked when shadows moved too quickly past his peripheral vision, still struck out when memories only he could see crowded too close to his consciousness. He charged at phantoms that carried the scent of old betrayals, his hooves cutting furrows in earth that absorbed his fury without judgment. The cowboy's response never varied, never escalated, to match the horse's panic. His presence remained as constant as sunrise, neither retreating in defeat nor advancing in aggression, but simply existing in the space where patience intersected with possibility. He moved through the daily routines of feeding and cleaning with the steady rhythm of someone who understood that consistency was its own form of communication. Gradually, imperceptibly, the edges of the gelding's rage began to soften like metal shaped by countless gentle hammers rather than one violent blow. The transformation happened in whispers rather than announcements, in the barely perceptible lengthening of moments, when his breathing slowed, when his muscles unclenched, when his eyes held curiosity instead of calculation. The cowboy's refusal to give up or give in became a kind of gravity that slowly pulled the horse's orbit closer to the possibility of connection. His consistent presence started to penetrate the armor of fear the gelding had worn for so long, not by breaking through, but by proving, day after patient day, that some humans operated by different rules than the ones that had taught the horse to expect pain from every extended hand. In the evening light that painted the ranch in shades of amber and possibility, both man and horse stood a little closer to each other than they had the day before. Their shared space measured not in feet, but in the accumulation of moments when violence wasn't necessary, when trust became something they could practice, rather than something they had lost forever. Miracles announced themselves, not with fanfare, but with a profound quiet of fundamental change. And on that particular morning, when golden light bathed the ranch in warmth that seemed to penetrate deeper than skin, something shifted between man and horse that would reshape the very foundation of what both believed possible. The air itself felt different, charged with the electricity of potential, finally finding its moment to transform from possibility into reality. The brown gelding stood motionless in his paddock as the cowboy approached, but for the first time in all their weeks together, his stillness wasn't born of calculation or defensive positioning. His ears pointed forward with genuine curiosity, rather than the flattened weariness that had become his signature expression. The rigid tension that had defined every muscle in his body for so long had softened into something that resembled actual peace. When weathered hands reached toward his neck, the gelding didn't flinch, didn't coil his muscles in preparation for flight or fight. Instead, he remained perfectly still as those gentle fingers traced the length of his dark mane, feeling the warmth of skin that had learned to trust the intentions behind the touch. The contact lasted long enough to matter, long enough to register as communication rather than mere accident. This wasn't surrender in the traditional sense, the defeated capitulation of a spirit broken beyond repair. This was acceptance, the conscious choice of a creature who had finally understood that not all humans came bearing pain, that some hands offered healing instead of harm. The distinction was crucial, written in the soft exhale that escaped his nostrils and the gradual lowering of his head as the cowboy's palm settled against his neck. The transformation wasn't complete. Both man and horse understood that healing was a process measured in seasons rather than moments, but the foundation of trust had been laid with the careful precision of a master craftsman, each day of patient presence adding another stone to a structure that could support the weight of genuine partnership. The morning light caught the subtle changes in the gelding's posture, the way he carried his head with quiet dignity rather than defensive arrogance. His eyes held a softness that spoke of possibilities he was beginning to believe in again, of futures that might include kindness rather than simply survival. The scars on his hide remained, but they no longer defined him completely. The cowboy's breathing had changed too, settling into the rhythm of someone who had just witnessed the exact moment when faith becomes fact. His hand remained steady against the horse's neck, feeling the strong pulse beneath warm skin, the steady heartbeat of a creature who had chosen to risk trust one more time, despite everything experience had taught him about the dangers of vulnerability. In that golden-lit paddock, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a ranch waking to another day, two damaged souls had found their way to the beginning of something neither had dared hope for. The breakthrough wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was as gentle and inevitable as sunrise, marking not an end to their journey together, but the first step into territory where healing and hope could coexist in the same breath. Some transformations take root so quietly that their completion arrives like sunrise, inevitable, beautiful, and impossible to pinpoint to a single moment, yet undeniably real when witnessed in its fullness. Months had passed since that dusty auction ground, where desperation and hope had collided in ways that changed the trajectory of two lives forever. And now the same brown gelding, who once terrorized handlers with his rage, moved across the ranch pastures with quiet dignity that spoke of profound inner peace. His coat gleamed with the health that comes only from consistent care and genuine contentment, each strand catching the morning light like copper wire burnished to perfection. The ribs that once pressed sharply against scarred skin had filled out with proper muscle and fat, his frame carrying the substance of an animal who no longer had to worry about where his next meal might come from or whether the hands that fed him carried kindness or cruelty. But the most remarkable transformation lived in his eyes, those same dark orbs that had once burned with defensive fury now holding peace instead of panic, curiosity instead of calculation. They tracked movement across the pasture with interest rather than suspicion, taking in the world as a place of potential pleasure rather than inevitable pain. When birds landed on the fence posts near him, he watched with gentle attention rather than startling at their sudden presence. His hooves carried him with purpose rather than desperation, each step deliberate and confident as he moved between the shade of oak trees and the warmth of open grass. There was rhythm in his movement now, the natural grace of a creature who had remembered that his body was designed for beauty as well as survival. The old cowboy watched from his porch, coffee growing cold in hands that had learned to be still enough to witness miracles without disturbing them. His weathered frame settled into the familiar chair that had supported him through countless such moments of quiet observation. But this one felt different, weighted with the understanding that something fundamental had been restored, not just in the horse, but in his own understanding of what redemption looked like when it moved on four legs. He knew, with the certainty that comes from decades of working with damaged things, that in saving this horse, he had somehow saved a piece of himself. The patience required to heal another creature's wounds had also healed wounds in his own spirit that he hadn't even realized were still bleeding. Some rescues worked both ways, creating bonds that transformed both the giver and receiver in ways that defied simple explanation. The greatest victories were often the quietest ones, measured not in ribbons or trophies but in the simple sight of a creature who had learned to trust again, to hope again, to believe in the possibility of gentle hands and peaceful days. In the space between what had been and what was now possible, both man and horse had found their way to a kind of grace that auction crowds could never recognize or value. The brown gelding lifted his head toward the porch, ears pricked forward, in acknowledgement of the man who had refused to give up on him. In that moment of mutual recognition, both understood they had traveled further than the miles between auction ground and ranch. They had journeyed from broken to whole, from fear to trust, from desperation to peace. If you enjoyed this story of healing and hope, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that remind us redemption is always possible when patience meets faith. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.